My name's David Owen. I'm the chair of the International Committee for UNISON North West. It's a great pleasure for me to chair this final session this afternoon. It's an honour to actually introduce one of our speakers who will be speaking later, who is the Cuban Ambassador to the UK, Comrade Teresita Vicente. It's a great pleasure for me to do that. But first, the guest here is Dan Smith, who is a trade union organiser, formerly an officer at the Cuba Solidarity Campaign, with responsibility for CSC's campaigning work with trade unions and the trade union movement and parliamentary groups. So first I'd like to introduce Dan to speak.
Thanks, David. Well, firstly, thank you very much for inviting me to speak today on behalf of the Cuba Solidarity Campaign, and obviously what a big honour it is to be able to speak alongside the new ambassador to the UK as well. I just want to say, first off, really, what a fantastic international zone we've had today. Very vibrant, sort of wide range of different sort of talks. And I think it's really important to use that on the sort of political agenda in the trade union and labour movement. Obviously, we've got a lot of sort of battles at home, fighting this government, fighting austerity, but it's important to keep that sort of global perspective, because capital is global after all, and we need to make sure that our movement is global as well. And from a sort of personal perspective, it's great to be able to speak as part of the May Day celebrations in Manchester, because when I was at the Cuba Solidarity Campaign, I had the great privilege to be able to take 3 groups of young trade unionists to take part in the May Day celebrations there. I don't know if anyone's seen the pictures from the sort of the parade in Havana yesterday on the news. But it really is incredible to see, up to 1 million people in Havana, knowing that that's sort of replicated in every town and city across the country, marching in support of something, marching in support of the achievements of the revolution, sort of health and education. And it's really quite sort of humbling to compare that to the sort of situation in Britain, when so often our sort of marches and demonstrations are in opposition to a government or to cuts or to austerity. And then I look forward to, after our revolution, we'll have a million people on the streets of Manchester marching in celebration of our achievements as well. Maybe this time next year. Now, from a campaigning point of view, it's been a fascinating time. Obviously, we had a huge victory just before Christmas when the remaining 3 members of the Miami 5 were returned to their family in Cuba after 16 long years imprisonment in the US, simply for fighting terrorism and trying to stop terrorist attacks against the Cuban people. Their return is a victory for Cuba, it's a victory for solidarity, but most of all, I think it's a victory for international campaigning and international pressure. And I'd like to thank everyone in the room who sort of took part in those activities, but in particular the British trade union movement, which has been important in their struggle for freedom. I don't know if anyone saw the Morning Star last week. There was an interview with Gerardo Hernandez, one of the 5, and he said obviously the political pressure was absolutely crucial in gaining freedom for the 5, but on a personal level it was the sort of emotional, individual support and solidarity which got them through on a day-to-day sort of basis. I mean, we're talking about people held in different prisons for 16 years, many of whom weren't allowed to see their families, quite often kept in solitary confinement. So on the day-to-day level, it was messages and letters from supporters across the world, but in particular in Britain, which got them through the sort of day-to-day struggle. So thank you anyone who sort of took part in that activity as well. But despite that victory, I think it's important to stress that all is not well, and we've still not been able to get visas for the Miami 5 to visit Britain. In particular, Rennie Gonzalez, who was the first of the 5 to be released, and we're appealing a visa so he can visit Britain. He's been able to visit France, Germany and Portugal, but I think the fact that he hasn't been able to visit Britain is probably a reflection of our so-called special relationship with the United States and continuing sort of aggression on their behalf. And of course, another big story just before Christmas was the so-called re-establishing of diplomatic ties between Cuba and the United States, symbolised, I think, most powerfully and most recently by that handshake between President Raul Castro and President Barack Obama at the Summit of the Americas. Again, it's important not to be complacent about what these changes represent, and Obama has said that he recognises the failure of the blockade and the failure of US aggression, but where has the actual substantial change been? Now, at the Cuban Solidarity Campaign, I spent a lot of my time travelling around trade union conferences, talking to delegates, and I've lost count of the number of times delegates said to me, oh, didn't the United States get rid of the blockade on Cuba when the Soviet Union collapsed? Well, nothing could be further from the truth. And in light of the recent supposed changes, it's doubly important to guard against this misnomer. The blockade is not over. It's now more important than ever to campaign for its end once and for all. In fact, it's the 53rd year of the illegal US blockade of Cuba, the longest economic blockade in the history of the world. It denies ordinary Cubans access to food, educational and medical equipment, more than half the medicines on the world market. Yes, there have been some changes. Both countries have moved towards re-establishing diplomatic relations. There has been an increase in the number of visitors from the United States to Cuba, and remittance levels, which is the amount of money that Cuban Americans are allowed to send home to relatives in Cuba, has been increased. But the blockade is definitely not over. In fact, some US politicians have declared their opposition already to Obama's modest amendments, and some are already threatening to block the appointment of a US ambassador to Cuba. Likewise, the Office for Foreign Asset Control are still empowered to find third-party companies active in countries outside of Cuba. And just to give you one example of that, at the same time as these sort of announcements just before Christmas, a German bank, Commerce Bank, was fined over $1 billion for dealing with Cuba, showing that the extraterritorial nature of the blockade is still very much in effect. And another example of that is payment to Cuban health workers who are active in the fight against Ebola in West Africa. They've had their sort of payment delayed again because of blockade legislation. And really the two sort of key pillars of the blockade, the Helms-Burton Act and the Torricelli Act, are still in effect, and they can only be repealed by Congress, and of course Obama, the Democrats, do not have a majority there. So the fact is that the US is still a threat to Cuba, and recent changes represent a change of tactics, not of objectives. Why then have these tactics changed? Well, the US foreign policy towards Cuba since the triumph of the revolution in 1959 has always been to isolate Cuba from the international community. We've seen recently, however, that it's been the US which itself has been isolated from the international community. Every year they vote against at the UN on the blockade. We see the only two countries voting for its continuation of the US and its good friends Israel. But in recent years we've seen a movement in the Latin American and Caribbean countries for a stronger sort of sense of regional identity, which has isolated the United States, first in the creation of ALBA, the Alliance of Bolivarian Republics, and more recently in CELAC, which is a broader sort of pan-American intercontinental organisation which explicitly excludes the US and Canada from membership. So in this sense, the change of tactics can be seen as a way for the US to sort of bring itself in from the cold. Like I said, US policy changes are ones of tactics rather than goals. And the objectives remain the same: to turn Cuba into an economic satellite of US big business. And that's why the changes so far on behalf of the US have focused on supporting the private sector in Cuba as a way to undermine the social system. Furthermore, just days after these simultaneous conferences in Washington and Havana on the 17th of December, the US allocated $11 million to what it calls advancing pragmatic objectives, or what you and I might call regime change. Now, the US may portray itself as this sort of land of the free and champions of democracy, but in my mind, any country that seeks to dictate to another country what its political or economic system should be is the very antithesis of democracy and the very opposite of freedom. And of course, there is another sort of rather large elephant in the room, the issue of Guantanamo Bay, which remains a key obstacle to the resumption of diplomatic ties. If the economic blockade is a relic of the Cold War, then the continuing military occupation of the Guantanamo naval base is a relic of an older conflict between Spain's fading colonial control and the rising imperial ambitions of the United States. It's the oldest US base outside the United States. It's the only US base with an indefinite lease, and it's the only base in the world which is held against the will of the host government. Now, although there have been some call in recent years for the closing of the prison at Guantanamo Bay, and I think we're all familiar with the human rights abuses that have been committed there, barely a voice has been heard calling for the full closure of the base and its return to Cuba. In fact, whilst Obama has expressed his will to close the prison, not that he's really done much in that direction, he remains adamant that the retention of the naval base in Cuba is integral to US national security. And indeed, one of the lead negotiators for the US with Cuba has said quite emphatically that the issue of Guantanamo is not on the table. So while this remains the case, the chance of any diplomatic or political rapprochement remains a distant pipe dream. Furthermore, from a campaigning point of view, from CSC, it's important to demonstrate that the issue of Guantanamo Bay is not just about human rights, although obviously that is a major issue, but about the continuing violation of Cuba's sovereign territory by an external power. It symbolises the US's continuing desire to interfere and dominate Cuba's affairs. Again, this is demonstrated quite in a clear way by the Helms-Burton Law, which states that the US would only return Guantanamo to Cuba if Cuba agrees to regime change. Where have we heard that before? And we have the US, again, this sort of bastion of democracy, trying to tell its closest neighbours what to do. And just imagine if it was the other way around. Imagine if it was Cuba that had a military base in the United States, in Miami or Washington or New York, somewhere like that. I mean, I'm not a political expert on the United States, but I can't imagine the US government or the US people accepting such an arrangement. So why then is it acceptable for Cuba to accept a military base in its own backyard? Quite simply, it's not. So if Obama is serious about approaching with Cuba, then the future of Guantanamo must be a central issue. Without real change, it's clear that US policy towards Cuba remains one of dominance and interference. Of course, efforts to soften the blockade to be welcomed, but failure to address this long-standing territorial dispute over Guantanamo further undermines any efforts towards reconciliation and really does draw into question motivation behind these policy changes. So the continuing occupation of Guantanamo is a flagrant violation of international law, an affront to Cuba's sovereignty and a block to reconciliation. It's clear that the US continues to disregard Cuba's right to self-determination. That's why we need to build the international campaign for Guantanamo to be returned to Cuba. That is why we must continue to serve Solidarity Cuba. That's why the US will continue and will continue to undermine Cuba, and we'll be launching a big campaign for Guantanamo to be returned to Cuba at CSC very shortly. But I'd just like to sort of finish with this sort of idea that solidarity isn't just a one-way process. It's not just what we can offer, Cuba and the Cuban people. It's about mutual support and mutual understanding. And certainly from a personal point of view, it's what Cuba can offer us as an example and as a sort of beacon of change. Because despite being a less economically developed country, Cuba is a world leader in the field of health, education, and of course internationalism. And if there is anyone standing for election on Thursday, start taking notes, because these are the sort of policies we want introduced on Friday. Because according to the World Bank, Cuba spends 13% of its GDP on education. That's the highest in the world, and more than doubles the 6% that we spend on education in Britain. In education in Cuba is free, it's universal, and that's from sort of preschool level all the way up to sort of doctorate and postgraduate level. Uniforms are free, school meals are free, and if families need preschool or post-school care, that is also free. And if children are unable to go to school, then mobile teachers are deployed. Compare this to the UK, where we're in the last sort of handful of years, and even beyond back to the last Labour government, we see the rise of academies, the rise of free school, and the rise of untrained teachers. And we're left with the sort of uninspiring choice on Thursday whether we vote for a government that has £6,000 or £9,000 tuition fees. Likewise, in the terms of health, Cuba's achievements are quite incredible, with life expectancy of 78.5 years. Compare that to some places in Britain, in Glasgow, when you're talking about sort of 50 odd for men, it's really unbelievable. And infant mortality is incredibly low, 5 per 1,000 live births, and certainly in some provinces in Cienfuegos, that's as low as 3 per 1,000. Truly is staggering. Why is that? Because it's a system based on community and preventative care, and Cuba is consistently cited by Save the Children as the best country in the developing world to be a child or a mother. And again, I mean, we've spoken about it in a lot of the sessions today already, but compare that to the UK, where we've had the insidious Health and Social Care Bill, and the slow creep of NHS privatisation, and the dark shadow of TTIP, which threatens to rip apart our public services. But I think the true strength of Cuba is shown in its unflinching internationalism, from fighting apartheid in South Africa to contemporary literacy and health campaigns. Just a couple of examples. 9 million people in the developing world have been taught how to read and write through Cuba's Yo Se Puedo, Yes I Can literacy program. And Operation Miracle, which is a joint project with Venezuela, has restored the sight of 3.4 million people in 34 countries completely free of charge. And of course, there are more than 51,000 Cuban health professionals currently working around the world in different countries. I mean, that's, just to put that into context, that's more than Médecins Sans Frontières and the Red Cross, organisations which we've all heard about, remarkable organisations, but where do Cuba get the same sort of credit and the same sort of thanks? We just don't see it. And more recently, the fight against Ebola, 250 voluntary health workers took part in those efforts. And there's a further 4,000 taking part in preventative efforts in 32 African countries. Compare that to the sort of development work that we've done in Britain, when we're the sort of 5th or 6th largest country in the world. It truly is staggering. So just to finish on some sort of concrete examples of what we can do to support Cuba and support the Cuban people. Obviously, if you're not a member of the Cuba Solidarity Campaign, please do join. We're a voluntary organisation funded by membership and affiliation. It's only £20 a year if you're waged, or £8 a year if you're unwaged, and you can join at the Manchester CSC store through there. And if you're active in your trade union, which I'm sure most people are, please ask your branch to get affiliated to the campaign if they're not already. But one of the best ways to sort of find out and experience the Cuban Revolution, its achievements, is to visit the country. CSC does a lot of study tours, brigades, cycle challenges, stuff like that. So really do think about sort of going to Cuba if you can afford it. And again, there's information on the tours outside. But I think the easiest thing to do, and probably the most important thing, is to counter the myths and the misinformation about Cuba. Talk about the reality in Cuba, talk about its achievements, talk about its internationalism, and let people know that another world is not only possible, but it's being made today in Cuba. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Dan. It was brilliant, which I knew it would be. And, well, I'll be next Thursday. Looks like I'll be playing with political asylum. Anyway, so thank you very much, Dan. I really appreciate that. It's a lot to think there. So, without further ado, I'd like to introduce comrade Teresita Vicente.
Thank you. Thanks for an excellent presentation. I couldn't do it better. I will try with my best English. And may I stay seated or should I stand? No? It's fine this way? Thank you. Thank you.
Could you
yeah,
say
back
sorry, if you can't see
I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I will try with my best English. First of all, I want to thank you all for your interest. Certainly we are living an interest time in Cuba and in the Latin American region. And first of all, I want to thank all of you for the work done for 10 years for the liberation of the 5 Cubans. They are back at their homeland and they are back at their families because of the international pressure, the political pressure. And this is important to you to know that we recognize and we are highly thankful for that support. Having said that, I think everybody almost in the world is guessing what is happening now around Cuba and what is going to happen in Cuba in the next years. I should say that there is a big challenge what we are confronting now. It's a challenge that is more related to the ideological work, and the international solidarity will play a very, very important role as in the past around Cuba. From the December the 17th on, there are great expectations because the announcement of the restoring of the relations between the United States and Cuba. And first idea I want to share with you is the restoring of the relations does not mean or will not mean the normalization of the relations of the two countries, bilateral relations. The blockade is still there, with all the implementation, all the strengths. You know that it's being applied for more than 50 years now. The announcement of the intentions of the decision of the President of the United States of removing Cuba of the list of the states sponsoring terrorism is a political expression of the new policy of the United States. But that will not mean that the blockade will be end or that we will have access to what we are deprived for more than 50 years. There are three in the writing of the list. There are three things or benefits we could have that we are not going to have because those sanctions are written in other 10 different laws enacted in the time for 60 years in the United States Congress. So in practice, the fact that we will be, it seems so, removed from the list of the states sponsoring terrorism in practice will not mean a softening of the blockade. We are looking now at the, let's say, the consensus in the U.S. Political scene of changing the tactics with regard to Cuba. And that's the meaning of the new standing of the U.S. government. But the aims remains to the same, change of regime, as they call it. They call this. There is a recognition from the part of the U.S. President of the failure of the policy, that they have been implementing for those years, and a change of tactics were needed. Not only because there are lobbies inside the United States claiming for that change of policy, but also because a new situation in our region, in Latin America. For many years now, we have been working together with different governments in Latin America, Nicaraguan government, government of Bolivia, Evo Morales, Ecuador, Venezuela, to implement new organizations in the favor of Latin America. For example, we have now CELAC. CELAC, you mentioned it, comprises all the Latin American and Caribbean countries, not United States and Canada. And we have also ALBA. It's a Bolivarian alternative for the peoples of America, with very, let's say, new ways to construct the economic relations in our region. Changing the way you relate to each other, where solidarity and complementarity is the aim of those kind of organizations. But also on the political scene, there are very many new advances against the traditional policy of the United States. So perceiving that, they realize that they cannot approach our region in the same way they were acting for decades. That's why they support, politically speaking, the return of Cuba to the summits of the Americas. This is a new scenario for Cuba. It's not an easy one because still inside the Organization of American States, United States is dictating policies. They are the major contributors, so they dictate the policy of the Organization of American States. But the fact that the two summits from 2009 in Trinidad and Tobago and later on in Colombia, the governments of Latin America very clearly stated that they will not go to the next summit if the government of Cuba, if Cuba has not the place in the concert of Latin America as it should have. So this could be seen as a victory of the unity of the Latin American countries and the Caribbean, as the recognition of the failure of the policy is also a victory of the resistance of the Cuban people and the solidarity of the peoples with Cuba. Normalization will come, hopefully, if the U.S. complies with the legitimate demands of the Cuban people. And you mentioned the Guantanamo territory illegally occupied by the United States. This is so very unfair demand for Cuba, but also in the next future they should show that they are willing to lift the blockade. The President of the United States has many executive powers to end some measures of the blockade. Important steps to be taken is not only that the Congress will support him, there are other measures that they should be taken by the Congress, but they can do much. For example, they can allow the U.S. citizens to travel to Cuba. They are deprived of their rights. They know that the day that they allow the U.S. citizens to travel to Cuba, this is the real end of the blockade. Not only because the U.S. citizens will perceive the real Cuba, which is important for the, let's say, the contacts people to people, which are normal, being our neighbors, but also because the tourists, the U.S. citizens travel to Cuba will provide Cuba with resources that we are deprived for many years. The day that and he can also allow the Cubans, the Cuban enterprises to sell our goods in the United States. Now we are not normalized. We have been buying for some years specific goods in the United States, paying cash, and not having the possibility to export to U.S. We are buying goods around the world, double or 3 times the price of what we can have in the United States. So this is the real blockade, and for the last 4 or 5 years, they have been implementing financial actions, very, very aggressive financial actions against Cuba, harming the Cuban economy in an amazing way. For example, for normalize the relation, to sign the diplomatic relation, which is the first step to normalization, not the only one, but a very little small step for the normalization. We have very clearly said to the U.S. government that our office, our diplomatic office in the United States should have the same conditions as others. So they should have a bank account to work there. They are deprived of having a bank account to work at the United States. So the Cuban citizens living in the United States, more than 1 million Cubans, they don't have the possibility to receive the normal consular services because they can't pay the services through the banks. They should travel to Washington hours, stand there in long queues to meet the Cuban consular officials because they can't send the money through the banks. And this is impeding our offices to have a normalized services to the Cuban citizens. There are many, many things to improve in our relations as a first step to go further. And they are now discussing in Havana and in Washington those first steps to normalize the diplomatic relation. We know that the ending of the blockade is a long, long way to go. It will also depend on the next U.S. president, because you know, if there is a person of the same party or not, Republican, but in line with what the President Obama wants to do, there will be a long path to go. But if there is a Republican, far-right Republican against the normalization, we will see more difficulties in this I have a very good example of what those measures, so-called new measures, are not impacting in the situation of the blockade. For example, the new list that OFAC published, which is seen as a very progressive one because they removed from the list some ships, enterprise, and individuals. The ships that were removed, they are not working anymore. The people that they removed from the list are dead. And the enterprises removed are not working for years now. So it's like fireworks to the world, trying to say, look, we are doing things, but in reality, there is something politically speaking to impress the international community, the public opinion, but at the end it's not having a big impact. I want also to say that Cuba is preparing itself to present again in October the resolution against the U.S. blockade. And we are letting the people know that we will keep working politically to let the people know that we need the support for lifting the blockade. So what you will see in the next future is the Cuban government requesting support from the other governments that has expressed for many years the support to the lifting of the blockade. But again in October we will present a resolution and we will request your support also as friends of Cuba to obtain support of the international community to show to the United States government that countries around the world are not convinced that they are working in that direction. Having said that, we as a country have been affected, economically speaking, for many years. So the lifting of the blockade, the normalization of the economic links will be beneficial for the Cuban economy and will bring normality, hopefully, for the life of 11 million Cubans. So we should work hard with your support for the ending of the blockade. And we will be very grateful to take from you, as usual, this support. I want to stop now here because I will be very glad if you pose questions and I will be able to answer to them. Thank you very much.
So, questions? Yes.
Thank you for that. I'm a member of two women's organisations, the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, which is 100 years old, and the National Assembly of Women. I wonder do you still have this amazing organisation, the Federación de Mujeres Cubanas, and can we make some practical connections with you?
Okay, can I take it further too, like they do on the TV programmes? Yes, please.
It's just got
yes, sir.
I could get Teresita to talk a bit more. A lot of people that I've seen on the stall today, they're saying, oh, well, they want to visit Cuba and they want to see it before it changes. And I think there's this common impression that, once that contact comes with America, that's it, changed. And like you were saying, that's not the case. It's just if you could talk a little bit about, you were saying that you felt that the gains of the revolution was still very secure and there was never ever going to be a problem that, with this contact with America, that was the end of everything.
And yes, sir.
Just a question about you mentioned the Cuban government is going to request support from people to lift the blockade, and I think right now, like especially in the US, there's maybe you've been following the protests against police killings in Baltimore, all over the US, and then there's actions against for $15 an hour in Walmart, McDonald's, about, because I know Raul when he spoke at the summit and before that, he says that he was talking about fights like that. Because I think the US government said, we want to see civil society in Cuba, referring to dissident groups. And then Raul replied, said, we also want to see civil society, we want to see the protesters against police killings, people fighting austerity or whatever in Europe. And anyway, what do you think about these events in the US?
Okay.
Thank you. Well, yes, we still have this very amazing, well-organized organization of women. They have been working for decades and they have amazing results with regard to the participation of women in our society, not only political participation but economic. As a matter of fact, more than 50% of women are labor force in Cuba in different sectors. For example, in health, public health is more than 60%, almost 70% of female workers. And in some other sectors where the traditional women were not important, they are now participating. And with regard to the mothers, single mothers, and helping mothers to keep their children at the daycare centers, they are working hard in that regard, in spite of the blockade, really. But I think you can help a lot establishing relations and exchanging experiences, and perhaps doing joint projects also, providing in these projects new sources of jobs for women, non-traditional sectors, workshops. So there is much to do. I mean, bilateral with your organization for Cuban women. So I will encourage you to, and if you need some support, we can do as an embassy. We will be delighted to connect you both. Thank you. Well, I think the party, the Cuban Communist Party, regarding the gains of the revolution and how to keep them to keep them safely, in this new situation we are living in and we will be living in. And I think education, as we were talking before, and culture, and the political education for many years will lead us to keep all the gains of the revolution. And the party, very clearly, when they organized the 6th Congress in 2010, they were preparing the people to new situation and consolidating, the political preparedness to go further in this objective. I think what we can obtain from a normalized situation with the United States is to consolidate our economy, and to consolidate our economy will lead to consolidate our gains. And there is a decision of the Cuban people of maintaining our system, economic system and political system. So this is not a change of system, this is a new development in consolidating our socialist system. There is there is awareness of the challenges we will confront. But I think we will keep in our path, no, to have a better socialism, to improve, to rectify also what we have done not in the best way, mistakes, and the path to socialism is not an easy one when you are a different society and the international economic system is pressing you in a very hard way, no? So you are unique in a sense, and you are dealing with a different system everywhere you have a relation, and that takes a lot of effort, no? But I think we will obtain a better system. We will have still a young generation working for the socialism in Cuba, and education will provide also with this result. Well, one thing we established also, what kind of relation we are establishing with the U.S. government is a human rights dialogue. Because we have too much to say on the system of the imperialism and the way they treat their own people, no? And the lack of social safety and health system and education system and all the policial violence against their own people. So we, at the official level, we are having now this dialogue, and they should listen to us what we think about their system, their society. I think the fact that in the future perhaps the U.S. citizens could visit Cuba will have a very positive impact in U.S. society. I mean, they could, not the poor people perhaps, but it's not very expensive to travel from Cuba from the United States. We are close neighbors, so it's not very expensive. And that will have a positive impact in the U.S. society. But no doubt that they are not an example to follow, and that they are trying to present still now a U.S. society as a model. If you go back to the summit of Panama of the Americas and you listen to the president's speech, he was very proud to present the gains. And even if he was saying that they will not approach Latin America in the same way as in the past, that they will not press Latin America, exert pressure to conduct Latin American society to the example of U.S. society. Even that, if you think in terms of, look at him, he was so proud of presenting the U.S. society. But that's U.S. society, that's U.S. policy. They are presenting, the U.S. political class is presenting U.S. as a model, and they're still presenting it. The reality is different. So I think we have gained a step forward when we said to them, well, listen, you have your own opinions on Cuban society, but we have opinions. If you are ready to listen from us what we think about your society, we are here. And they accept the challenge, which is a very interesting political and ideological challenge also. So I think we will also come from this dialogue with more strength and more belief in what we have achieved for years in Cuba and our society.
I'll just come back onto a couple of things, because I know people really want to listen to the ambassador and not to me. But about Federation of Cuban Women, I mean, we've had delegations across before, CSC brought delegations across, and when we do study tours and brigades to Cuba, there's always meetings with the FMC, and that's, for me, it's always one of the most fascinating part of the trip, so that's a good way to do that. Just coming back to Bruce briefly about wanting, people saying, I want to go to Cuba before it changes. Well, I mean, for 55 years, over 55 years, Cuba has been under siege from the United States. Whether that's sort of like US backing Batista or terrorist attacks on the island, the Bay of Pigs invasions, economic blockade, and funding sort of anti-state groups, things like that. 55 years it's survived, and it's remained true to its principles of internationalism, socialism, and equality. And there's no reason that would change because it's deeply ingrained within the sort of Cuban culture and the revolution.
Appreciate that. Okay, there's a lady there. Would you like to?
Okay.
We're going to overrun, which is great.
Okay. First, I think what Obama says in Panama is one thing, and what U.S. government is doing towards Venezuela speaks the truth. But I want to thank Teresita for pointing out to us the challenges and the struggle that's ahead of us. I think that's very important. And in that context, I want to take up the Cuban 5, because yes, the international solidarity was very important, and the jury of millions, but also the very, very strong support from the Cuban people, which I think is important to take note of. And also how the Cuban 5 comported themselves in prison, where they were impossible to break, and they gained respect of fellow prisoners and people around the world. I think they acted like revolutionaries, which they were. And of course, the victory is important for all of us, made us stronger. But I wanted to ask Teresita about the importance of this victory for Cuba, and the importance in the challenges that you face now, the ideological struggle that you talked about, or the battle for the ideas. And because these 5 Cubans are special, but they're also very typically Cubans. And I'm thinking about all the 400,000 who went to Angola, for example. What is the importance of these kind of people in the struggles ahead? And I just, if I may, want to show a new book about paintings by Antonio Guerrero from prison and from the trial, and how it was biased against. I have some here, and there are some on the CSC booklet outside.
Thank you. There's a gentleman at the back there.
Yeah, first of all, excuse my ignorance, I'm a beginner to this topic. I'm just curious to know what role the United Nations played over the last 50 years and what you hope it will do in the future. Just a brief answer will suffice.
Okay. And any other questions or more? Yes, sir.
We keep hearing about the opinion of Britain and America towards Cuba. And as we have a general election coming shortly, I'd like to ask the Cuban ambassador what is her opinion of what's going on in our country. Consider we're the richest nation in the world, the 5th richest nation, and the majority of the parties that we can vote for all believe in cutting back in social welfare, education, the health service. There isn't enough money. And I'd just like her opinion, considering we like to give our opinion all the time about other countries.
Thank you. Well, you're right, Katerina. There is a potential in the Cuban society built for more than 50 years, ideological, political potential. And I think, I'm sure, because I'm part of the Cuban people, that all the time we believe when Fidel said they will return, we were so sure that they will return. because we, in first time, we knew that the cause sustained and the political support of the Cuban and the political awareness of our leadership will conduct us in one way or another, because I don't think we knew that this will be the solution or the way they return to Cuba. But look at the leadership of Cuba conducted the negotiations in a way that they obtained the return of the 3 remaining in the United States. So I deeply believe that we were sure, deep in our minds and heart, that they will be back in Cuba. And that's because we trust the Cuban Revolution. The Cuban people trust the Cuban leadership and trust not only the will but the intelligence, no, of the leadership to conduct things in the way that will benefit the Cuban society and the Cuban people. And there is just so many Cubans have fought in Angola for the independence, to keep the independence of Angola, not only in Angola, in Africa, in Latin America. And this is something that we keep as a treasure in our society, in our awareness of what we kind of society we are constructing and what we want to keep in the future. Solidarity in different ways. These are different times, not times of the war in Angola, but a different kind of war. And I think we as a society are being raised in such a way that will preserve our gains in that society. And we will not stop giving solidarity to other people or to other communities. So there is this treasure of the Cuban society that still is there, and with all this power will work in the future in these new challenges and conditions we have. And remember, before the fight, we had the case of Elian, the Cuban child brought to the United States. And the way that Cuban leadership conducted the work to return Elian to Cuba was also an example of political awareness and the political work done. So I believe that we all will believe that the fight will return to Cuba. Not exactly the way it happened, because, well, they are international scenarios, opportunities also, and political strategy conducting to obtain this result. But I think we have this rich, cultivated society, and that's a guarantee to keep our gains. The voting in the United Nations it has a moral, more than a practical impact, but it's important. So it's not a vote that will oblige, that will press United States government to do what the international community chose them they want to do. But it's a moral sign of what the peoples of the world and governments of the world wants them to stop. So it's a very clear signal. This is a policy we are not supporting for years. Let's put an end to this. So it's a moral impact and it will be very important this year, again, to show them that the community of states in the world knows that they are not doing what they are saying. And we want you to do what we are politically saying. So this year will be a very special result, important of the very special importance in the political scene. As a diplomat, I can't. You know, here in Great Britain, in United Kingdom. I think you will have what you vote for. And the result will be the one that you obtain of your capability of mobilize people and to communicate with people, to let them know what you want in one regard or another. And I know that the capitalism is being, I've been in several developed countries, and yes, there is a deterioration of the conditions of the social welfare state, no, for many years. But I think using the tools that the people has will have an impact. No? I cannot tell you what to do. Of course, I know very well what you want in Cuba, but not here.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much for that. We're going to have to wind up there now. We're talking about great for us. It's been a great honour.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. I'd just like to say